In the year 1873, a bizarre and spine-chilling discovery was made that would spark morbid intrigue throughout the country. The abominable actions of a twisted few left the community speechless, giving ill-fated closure to families that had loved ones seemingly disappear out of thin air. What was unearthed was the stuff of nightmares, and certainly stranger than fiction. Howdy, this is Dave, and in this video, we will be covering the Bloody Benders. Back in the fall of 1870, several families built homesteads in and around Osage Township, located in the northwest area of Labette, Kansas. John Bender Sr. and John Bender Jr. owned 160 acres in total and were there first to get things started. They built a cabin and a barn, and they also dug a well. Then John Sr.'s wife, Elvira, and their daughter, Kate, arrived to join them, planting a garden and an apple orchard. The property was located close to the Great Osage Trail, which put them in an interesting position since the trail was the only road open to those continuing west. They took advantage of this by dividing up their cabin, separating it with a canvas wagon cover. The rear of the cabin was the designated living quarters, and the front served as a general store that sold dry goods. The front area also had a kitchen and a table set up so that travelers could eat something before they went on their way. John Bender Sr. was about 60 years old and did not speak much English. What little he actually knew was wasted on his poor guttural enunciations, which made most of what he said unintelligible. Elvira Bender was 55 years old and also supposedly did not speak a lot of English. She was not a friendly person. In fact, she was notoriously so uncivil that the neighbors referred to her as She-Devil. John Bender Jr. was around 25 and noted as a good-looking guy. Handsome, with a mustache and auburn hair. He spoke fluent English with a German accent and was inclined to laugh without purpose. This aimless laughter came off as buffoonery, and people considered him to be a little off. Kate Bender, approximately 23, spoke English well, without much accent. She would conduct seances and considered herself a healer and psychic. She would distribute flyers around the community to promote her abilities. She was easy on the eyes, and no doubt the biggest attraction to the Benders Inn. It is believed that the Benders were German immigrants, but no definitive proof to the family's origin or relationship to one another has ever been found. In the Emporia News, published May 23, 1873, John Sr. was identified with the name William Bender. Elvira had been previously married at least twice before John, and is said to have had upwards of 12 children. It was rumored that she had murdered her husbands, although there is no evidence. Kate was allegedly Elvira's fifth daughter, but some of the neighbors were convinced that Kate and John Jr. acted more like husband and wife than siblings. Their standing within the community was not held in very high esteem. In fact, much of what is documented about them does not sound very flattering. The following quotes are from people who knew the Benders and committed their words to paper. The old man was a repulsive, hideous brute, without a redeeming trait. Dirty, profane, and ill-tempered. Old Mrs. Bender was a dirty old Dutch crone. Her face was a fit picture of the midnight hag that wove the spell, murderous ambition about the soul of Macbeth. Young Bender, seen when excited, recalled the grave-robbing hyena at once to mind. Kate proclaimed herself responsible to no one save herself. To elaborate on that, Kate declared herself a medium and would give out lectures to whoever would listen. She was heard to say that murder could be a good thing, and she was also a major advocate for free love. She even had no problem with open dialogue about the carnal relations she had with her brother, John Jr. She wrote about it in a manuscript, stating, "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their proper sway, Even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister, I say it should not be smothered. I'm personally among the opinion that they were pretending to be a family, but even if Kate and John Jr. weren't really related, this is still a gross thing to say. In May 1871, a body was found in Drum Creek. The deceased was identified as a man named Jones. His skull was crushed in and his throat had been cut. Fingers were pointed at the owner of the Drum Creek, but ultimately nothing came of it. In February 1872, 2 more bodies were stumbled upon. Both were men, and they also displayed the same injuries as Jones. By the year 1873, it was not uncommon to hear of people going missing when they passed through that region, and many travelers elected to avoid the trail entirely and take their chances elsewhere. It was already a rough area that was known for horse thieves and villains that would also use the trail. In response, there were vigilance committees that would take action after someone had gone missing. They would make arrests that wouldn't lead to anything, and the authorities would let the suspect go. Numerous innocent men that had caught the attention of the committees were ran out of the county. Although I'm sure these committees meant well, they always seemed to go after the wrong person, and the murders and disappearances continued to go unchecked. In the winter months of 1872 in Independence, Kansas, a man named George Newton Longcore was relocating to Iowa with his infant daughter, Mary Ann. They were never seen or heard from ever again. When spring arrived in 1873, Longcore's former neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, took it upon himself to set out in search of the missing father and daughter. He questioned every homesteader that he passed until he reached the city of Fort Scott. On March 9th, Dr. York began his returning pilgrimage to Independence. He never made it back. Dr. York's disappearance did not go unnoticed. He had 2 brothers that were on top of it. Ed York, who actually lived in Fort Scott where the doctor was riding from, and his other brother was Colonel Alexander M. York, a no-nonsense Civil War veteran, lawyer, and a member of the Kansas State Senate. Colonel York lived in Independence, where Dr. York was heading. When he was convinced that something bad must have happened, he took a company of 50 men and searched the trail, questioning everyone that they came across. On the 28th of March, 1873, Colonel York and a Mr. Johnson hopped from their horses and walked into the Bender's Inn. The colonel greeted the Benders and explained to them that his brother had gone missing, and inquired if they saw him come through. They confirmed that Dr. York had stayed with them, but he had gone on his way. They suggested that he may have had a run-in with Native Americans. Colonel York knew that this was always a possibility. They offered the men something to eat and they stayed for dinner, with no attempts of murder taking place. On the 3rd of April, Colonel York and several armed men returned to the Bender's Inn. He told them that he heard that a woman was threatened with knives and was seen fleeing their cabin. Elvira feigned ignorance due to the apparent language barrier, but the children denied the claims. The colonel wasn't going to back down that easily, and repeated the claim of the incident back to them. This infuriated Elvira, and she began yelling at the men, telling them to leave immediately. In doing so, she revealed that she had a much better grasp on the English language than she had been leading on. Before they left the premises, Kate took Colonel York aside and asked if he would come back the next Friday evening. She offered to use her clairvoyant abilities to try and locate his brother. When they left, the men that accompanied the colonel were certain that the Benders and a neighboring family, the Roaches, were responsible for everything and wanted them all strung up. However, Colonel York kept his composure and told them that they needed to find more evidence first. Little did they know, while all this was happening, some of the neighboring communities began making harsh accusations against Osage, saying that they were responsible for causing all of the disappearances. Osage Township decided to set up a meeting, and 75 people, including Colonel York and both Bender men, congregated in a schoolhouse to address the issue. The topic of discussion included all of the missing people, and eventually the summit led to an agreement to obtain a warrant to search every homestead in the area. 3 days after the Osage deliberations, a cattle driver was moving his herd past the Benders' property. As he was riding by, he noticed that the place looked deserted and the animals had not been taken care of. He told the township trustee about the abandonment, but bad weather kept him from getting out there to investigate. When he was able to go to the property, he called for volunteers, and a search party of several hundred showed up to help, which included Colonel York. When they entered the cabin, they found it empty of essentials like food, clothing, and personal items. It didn't take long for them to notice a foul stench that was eventually traced to a bed. When they moved it aside, they found a trap door that was nailed shut. When they finally opened the door, they found an empty room that had clotted blood on the floor. Using sledgehammers, they broke up the stone slab flooring, but found no other evidence. They then came to the conclusion that the smell was coming from blood that had already soaked into the soil. Going off of that logic, the volunteers physically lifted the cabin off of its foundation and moved it aside so they could dig what was beneath. But still no bodies were found. The search expanded out to other parts of the property. They used a metal rod to probe the ground in the newly dug areas of the garden and orchard. Later that evening, the remains of 9 were found, not including the body of Dr. York, who was found buried face down in a shallow grave, his feet barely covered by the dirt. The next morning, 8 more bodies were exhumed. 7 of them were in what could be considered graves. 1 was found in a well. All but 1 of the bodies had their heads caved in and their throats slit. A number of unclaimed body parts were also discovered. But most tragically, the body of a young girl was found. She managed to avoid desecration and showed no injuries of cause of death. She is thought to have asphyxiated due to strangulation or being buried alive. It is thought that the number of victims is actually much higher than those that they were able to find. The killing method appears to have been carried out the same way for every victim. It is thought that when the Benders had a guest, they would have them sit in a seat of honor, which was strategically placed over the trap door, with the guest's back facing the wagon-covered divider. Depending on the scenario, Kate distracted the guest while John Jr. would appear from behind the curtain with a hammer and strike the right side of the person's head. As the guest reacted to the devastating blow, one of the women would come up and cut their throat to guarantee death. The body would then be dropped through the trapdoor and into the cellar, where it would be stripped of possessions before being buried somewhere on the property. This presumed execution method was backed up by sources who claimed to have visited the Benders Inn. A man who came forward, William Pickering, said that he was offered the seat of honor, but upon further inspection, noticed some odd stains on the wagon cloth and did not feel comfortable sitting there. Kate got aggressive, threatening William with a knife, which instantly caused him to hightail it out of there. A Catholic priest visited the inn, whereupon he noticed one of the Bender men concealing a hammer, which made the priest uneasy, and he soon left. 2 men gave testimony that they had gone to the Benders Inn to witness Kate's psychic abilities. When they stayed for dinner, they refused to sit at the table and instead preferred to eat standing at the main counter. Kate was overbearing and insisted that they sit at the table, becoming abusive in the process. Shortly after standing their ground, both Bender men emerged from behind the curtain. The 2 men began to piece together this strange interaction and felt unsettled, deciding it was time to go. Reacting in favor of these flight instincts absolutely saved these people's lives. They were very lucky. There were also several bullet holes in the sides and roof of the cabin, indicating that some of the victims may have fought back. Colonel York almost certainly would have had a spectrum of emotions run through him during this entire ordeal. Not only did he lose his brother in this ghastly fashion, but he could have met the same exact fate if he showed up the following week like he had planned, then confirming it was those who committed the terrible crime, only to have them escape. What a horrible ride. There have been many searches for the Benders throughout the years. Their team of unfed horses was found approximately 12 miles north of the inn. From there, it is said that they took the train and split up. Many posse and bounty hunters claimed to have killed the Benders, but could never produce any proof, and no one ever collected the reward. Whether they escaped and lived the rest of their lives, or were apprehended and killed, nothing has been definitively proven, leaving those looking back on it to come to their own conclusions. It certainly leaves it open to interpretation if you were going to adapt it into a movie or game, because this has a Red Dead Strange Encounter written all over it. And that's where I'm going to leave it off on the Bloody Benders. If you found a way to enjoy this content, please feel free to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Until next time, have a good one.